All right, so now we're ready to start the painting. I'm going to first start in the background, so the area behind the wooden box and behind this top row of fruit. So while you're working on this painting, you can really work with any color scheme as long as you are working with your shadows or dark tones, your midtones, and your highlights. That way, everything still looks three-dimensional. So in order to get this background color, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to work from the photo and try and match that as closely as possible. I'm first starting with violet. And once I have some violet down in this middle area, I'm going to get a touch of yellow. And the reason for this is that the yellow will cut and neutralize some of that violet. Because as you're looking at the photo, you can probably see it has a little bit more of a gray tone. It's not really a true violet color. Now there is a little hint of blue, so I'm going to get a little bit of blue and add it to this. And then the last step is adding white. So I need to tint this down, meaning I need to make it a lot wider. And I'm going to add just a little bit more violet, make it a little darker. So for this background area, you do need quite a bit of paint because you do have a larger surface area to cover, because it makes up really almost a third of the painting. And it's still looking pretty purple or violet, so I'm going to just add a little bit more yellow, try and neutralize that just a little bit. So it'll help make more of a tone. And the colors that you're seeing on the screen, specifically with the paint, that is probably not entirely accurate just because there are some differences with how this is being recorded. I will try and get these as accurate as possible, though. Okay, so I have my background color, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint all of this background. And because we're using purple or violet with blue, this is going to be pretty dark, so you may not need two coats of paint. When working with lighter colors such as orange or yellow, those colors aren't as heavy, so they often require multiple layers of paint in order to cover your surface. And then as you're painting this background area, don't worry about accidentally covering up some of your fruit. That is why we are painting this background first, because once we start working with the actual fruit and making those more three-dimensional, we want these pieces of fruit to look like they're on top or in front of everything else. So that's why we're painting the background first. So you just want pretty good coverage throughout. And make sure to go in all the little places that you may even forget about, like we have this little corner right here. And as you're painting, if you are holding your brush on the metal, you'll have a lot more control than if you hold it higher up. So if you find yourself kind of losing control of your paintbrush and you're not really controlling the paint like you want, and just try adjusting your grip and how you're holding the brush. So that should help. And with tempera paint, the paint does dry lighter than when it originally goes on. So with the areas I've already painted, you can see that it's starting to look a little splotchy. It's not super even, and that's really the main reason why it's starting to look like that, just because part of the paint is already starting to dry. So with this temper paint, it does dry quite a bit faster than other paints, which is nice, but it can also make things a little difficult. So you just have to kind of know what you're doing and have a plan. So as you're painting this background, just make sure you cover everything. Try not to leave any white paper at all, because if you do, it does make your artwork look unfinished. So it is important to get all the little white areas and maybe little areas that can easily be skimmed. Do have to be fairly thorough. And the way in which I'm working side to side. So that way it's a little bit easier to keep track of what your layers of paint that you're working with. So just have a little area left. So right here, I'm going to go down. So that'll help kind of trim this side where the box is. And I want to make sure I don't accidentally cover the table that's right there. So right here is where the table starts slash stops, and then the background begins, where we have kind of that violet color. All right, so once I have all of my background finished, the next stage I am going to look at and begin painting is the box, where all of the fruit are either in front or they are resting on the top of the surface. Now, as you're working with this tempera paint, so right now I'm using this kind of chiseled brush. We don't want any water in this brush, because what the water will do with tempera is it thins out the paint. And that's because tempera is a water-based paint. So with this tabletop, this top part is lighter because the light is coming from above. So you can see that where the highlights are striking all the fruit. And then the side or the front of the box that we see, this is a lot darker, just kind of based on our lighting situation. So what I'm going to do for this top portion, I'm simply going to paint that green. And in order for us to get the kind of wooden texture, we're gonna have to layer this quite a bit. Now, sometimes green temper paint can be pretty thin, which you're probably seeing right now. You can kind of see some of my original sketch lines. So we're gonna have to layer this quite a bit. So there's really just a couple colors we're gonna work with. We're gonna work with this green on the top, and then we are going to create a color that will replicate the raw wood color, which is really seen on the edge of the box and then in a few areas throughout the top. So we're going to work with that also. Now, this surface is not as large as that background, so you'll want to take your time and make sure you're holding your brush on that metal portion that holds the bristles in place. So right now I'm just getting this base green down, and then that will allow me to layer in all the other textures to give it that wood grain appearance. work my way over here. So in this area, we're gonna have to work around quite a few of the fruit. But again, if you accidentally get paint on some of these pieces of fruit, don't worry about it. Once we start painting those, most of those marks should get covered up. So I'm definitely gonna have to be a little more precise on the left side of the top portion of the wooden box. Now we do have quite a few shadows on the top of the box that the fruit are creating. The shadows are pretty dark, but I'm not going to worry about this right now. We'll come back and do those once we start painting the actual fruit. All right, so I have just kind of the basic coat of green down for the top of the box. Now, we're probably going to have to use anywhere from like 3 to 5 layers of paint in order to get the effect that we're going to want to achieve with all of the wood grain that we see. Now, as I mentioned, there is this kind of raw wood that really creates the top corner of this box. And in order to create that color, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get some of this yellow, and I actually want some of this purple or violet. And the reason for that is that that edge of the box isn't just straight up yellow. It definitely has more of a brownish or tannish look to it. And by having a little bit of this violet mixed in with the yellow, what this will do, yellow and violet are complements. You mix those together, they're going to neutralize one another. And so it's going to tone down that yellow so it's not as intense. So I'm going to add just a little bit more of that violet to this mix. Now, we also have a bit of orange that shows up in this color that we're working with. So I'm going to pull some of this orange, mix this in. Don't want too much though. So my color is getting in the right direction, but we need to tint it. So I'm going to add just a little bit of white to this. And when tinting, I always add my white last, so that way I can start in small increments and then slowly add more if I need to. So this is going in the right direction. I think I need just a little bit more orange though. So now I'm getting closer to that tannish color. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to set down a little bit of this raw wood looking color. And I'm going to do this with a different brush, one that doesn't have any paint on it yet. And so I'm holding my brush on the metal. So I'm going to go right along the edge here. And then as this is in the process of drying, I may go back over it with my green paint. So as I'm doing this, if you have some of those kind of streaky brushstroke type textures that show up along the edge, that's not a bad thing. That can really kind of help emphasize the wood type texture that you're wanting to create. And we have a little bit of that wood color right on the edge. So I'm going to set some of this down and then blend it in a little. So I'm just going to repeat this process. So the top of this box does have that very like worn and weathered appearance to it because the green paint on the box has slowly weathered and it's really exposed the wood texture. So what I'm doing now, I'm not pressing down very hard. I'm just kind of like gliding my paintbrush over some of these areas to help emphasize that texture where you have kind of that yellowish value. A little bit back here. So I'm just using, essentially what are hatch lines. I'm just barely kind of skimming over this area with my paintbrush. And I have kind of this line that shows up in the very top. So I'm going to put that back in. Now, right now, I've really just been focusing on this side. I haven't gone over to the other side yet, but we will do that. So I'm going to let that dry just so I can get an idea of how this is actually going to look because it is pretty wet. And remember, when the paint is really wet, it is a lot darker. So now we'll go over to this other side. So we have this kind of raw wood color on the edge on this side also. So we'll do that. And same process, go back over with my green. And we do have some other colors, like there's some kind of darker marks that were created with, um, I think they were nails or nail holes at least. We see some of those over here. We'll add those in once that area dries a bit more. So for right now, this may look a little plain, but again, we'll come back in later with the shadows and apply those once we start working on the fruit. So now I'm taking this kind of raw wood color and blending it into the green when it's wet. So that helps emphasize and create some of that wood texture. I'll do a little bit more. And based on the wood grain that we see in the photo, I'm just going side to side. So we're working in a horizontal brushstroke pattern. So I'm trying not to deviate from that. Otherwise, that can kind of distort the appearance of what we're working with. So I'm just getting a little bit of paint on my brush and just very quickly creating lines. So that will help develop that wood grain. And I'm barely touching my paintbrush to the paper, so I'm just kind of lightly skimming over some of those areas. And if you need a sharp point on your brush, what you can do, so right now I have quite a bit of paint on my brush right here. If I take my paintbrush and kind of spin it in the paint, it'll allow me to get a sharper point. So now I can take that and just kind of lightly go over some of these areas where I want some of this wood grain texture. And a little bit back here. Then I'll use my other brush that has some green on it and blend these in a little bit better so they don't stand out as awkwardly. All right, so we're going to let that dry just a bit. And we're going to go ahead and work on the front side of this box. Now, this front side is quite a bit darker. So in order to achieve that, what I'm going to do, I'm going to use green, but I'm also going to shade it. And I'm going to do that without black. So I'm actually going to use violet. So I'm going to get a pretty healthy amount of violet, set it down here, and get quite a bit of green. So we have another surface that is fairly large. And so when I paint this onto that front side of the box, this is going to show up pretty dark, but again, it will dry quite a bit lighter. So you want to take that into consideration when you're painting. So you have to almost overcompensate. So I don't want to get it too light, but at the same time, I also don't want to get it too dark because this is going to be important to make this box look like it's three-dimensional, kind of based on our lighting. So I have this super dark green color that has been shaded with violet in order to really push the darkness of that color. And I'm going to do the same thing that I did at the top, where I'm just applying this base coat of this really dark green at first, and then I'll go back in and start working with a lot of these different values. Oops, accidentally got a little bit of paint right there, but not a big deal. That will get covered up once we get to that. So after I've finished this entire front side of the box, it may look kind of streaky, just kind of based on how I'm layering my paint. And because it is pretty dark, but we are seeing where this paint color is already starting to dry, which is why it may look a little spotty in places where it's lighter, and then it gets a little darker where I put my fresher coats of paint. So I need to go along the edge here, make sure I'm covering up that white paper that still exists. There we go. And we'll go back up. And again, notice I've not used any water at all. I don't even have a water cup over here. And if I did, and if I had water in my brushes, oh, this paint would be really thin. It would really look like watercolor, and that's not what we're trying to achieve right now. So as you're painting, using a synthetic hair brush like what I'm using and what the type that was in your art kits, those make for blending your colors with tempera paint a lot easier. Any type of coarser haired brush, it can kind of make things a little too textured, maybe a little too scratchy, where it actually kind of like pulls up and removes paint. So, just one thing to note. So, if you're working from home and using your own paintbrushes, or um, they're maybe a little bit different than what we have in the classroom, or that you got in your art kit, and the paint's not going on correctly, you may just want to check the type of paintbrush that you're working with. So sometimes that is the culprit, especially with tempera. That tempera can be a little temperamental, for lack of a better word. So it does take a little bit of practice just to kind of get in the swing of it. So, like the very top of the box, I'm just going side to side. So I'm really just working with that wood grain texture. Really, the only times I'm not is when I have to go around some of these pieces of fruit. So in that case, I'm really just kind of lining them with paint and then picking up my brush strokes that go left to right or right to left, kind of switch it up. And with tempera paint, it's one of those mediums that you've probably used before in maybe an elementary or middle school art class, but it really is kind of versatile. You can use it like watercolor, you can use it um, almost like a paint to sketch. So rather than sketching with a pencil, you can sketch with paint. So sometimes it's good just to sketch out your ideas with tempera, just to see how certain colors may look when they're next to one another. So artists are known for using tempera for that purpose. Mark Rothko often did that before working on his fairly large scale oil paintings. Now we do have some of that wood grain texture in this darker area. It's not quite as visible though, because it is a darker area of the painting, and this wood grain is a little bit lighter. But it does exist. We can see it mostly in this region. So just kind of a heads up over there. So I still have some of that color left. So what I'm gonna do, I'm not even gonna switch brushes. I still have that dark green on my brush. I'm gonna pick up some of this wood grain and just very quickly kind of brush this in. Again, make sure you're going side to side. So before I move any further in here, let's look at the top. So this is looking pretty good. Looks like it's all dry. One little really dark area right here, so that's still wet. But for the most part, we're seeing some of that wood grain texture. It could be a little stronger. So I can go back in here in a few minutes and kind of touch that up. But we do have some other areas, so I'm going to down below. So again, with my paintbrush, just I'm going to scrape off some of that extra paint so I get that nice kind of sharp chisel, almost razor sharp. And then I'm just very lightly going to go over this. And then you can get another brush. This brush has no paint on it. And I'm just really blending in this kind of natural wood grain color that I made a little bit ago. And if you hold your paintbrush like straight up and down, you get really sharp, fine lines. And you're probably seeing this in a photo, but there is like a pretty dark line that runs right here. So it almost looks like it runs through like the middle or lines up with the middle of the lemon. So that's something we can put in with that. I can just add, maybe a little bit of violet. So I'll do that in a second. Just going to keep working with kind of this lighter wood grain texture though. Try and finish adding some of that to kind of break up some of these values, just adds a little bit more interest, adds a little bit more texture to the painting. So right now, I'm just kind of working with whatever paint is left on my brush. I'm not even getting new paint. And I have some of that kind of wood grain color paint on my brush. So I'm just trying to scrape some more of that onto this area. And I can go back up here now and add a little bit more. So like this corner of the box is a little bit brighter, so I can even add a little bit more white, some of that kind of wood grain color, lighten it up just a bit. And I'm just gonna kind of dot some of that color in, and then I'll use this other brush to blend it. And we'll do some back here. So again, I just have my color on this brush. This brush has no paint on it. It's completely dry. I'm using it just to kind of blend in the wet paint to the areas that are already dry. So when blending your paints, you can blend wet paint into wet paint, or you can blend wet paint into dry paint, which is what I'm doing now since this is all dry. So the more texture and variety and color that you add to this wooden surface where we have all this wood grain, the better. If it's just really, really flat in color, it's not going to be as interesting. So right now I'm just taking my brush with that kind of yellowish raw wood color, basically just kind of lightly going over part of this tabletop, and taking my brush that's dry and going back over it to blend it in. All right, so now we're going to look at the actual table surface. So the area that looks pretty bright, kind of a brownish orange color. Before I do so, I do have some of this extra paint on my brush. I'm just going to take a paper towel. So the paper towel is dry. I'm just going to wipe all of that excess paint off. Again, I'm not using any water because I don't want to run the risk of thinning out my tempera paint too much. And so for this tabletop surface, the way in which I'm going to create that color, it definitely has kind of a orangish hue to it, but it has elements of brown. And so what I'm going to do, I'm just going to take orange paint and we're going to put this in a new cup area. So take my orange and I'm going to take quite a bit of it. And then I'm going to get blue, just a little kind of dollop of blue. Mix this in, and the reason I'm mixing these two together, again, it's like the violet and the yellow. I don't want that super saturated, almost OSU orange brightness to the surface. I need it to be kind of dull. So by adding the blue, it neutralizes the orange because they're complements. They're warm versus cool colors. And here I've created pretty basic brown color. I think I do need it to be a little brighter, so I'm going to pick up a little bit more orange and mix it in here. And again, this will dry just a little bit lighter. So I have to keep that in mind. All right, so I have that color. So we're going to start over here. And I'm just going to work in this horizontal fashion, left to right, covering the whole tabletop surface. So I'm going to set down this kind of orangish brown color first, and then I'll come back in and add the wood grain. So in the photo, it looks like black hatching lines. But again, we're trying not to use black, so I am going to use uh, violet, or I could even use blue, or I could even use blue mixed with violet to get a nice dark color to create those wood grain lines that you see in this table surface. And as I get closer to some of these pieces of fruit, as well as the bottom of the box, I want to slow down just a little bit, try and control my paintbrush so that my hand is doing what I want it to in terms of placing the paint going in the right direction. And with orange, it is a pretty thin color, and we'll see that here. I had this little drop of green that happened, and when I paint over this, you can still kind of see through it just a little bit. So even though we added blue to this orange, we really didn't add very much blue. And blue is a pretty dark color. You usually only need like maybe one or two coats to cover something with just straight up blue. The orange and yellows, those are really thin. So this color that I'm working with, because it was mostly orange, it's not going to cover the same as if it had a lot of blue in the paint. But with this table surface, the darker hatching lines that we'll work with in just a second, those are going to cover and kind of distract from some of these thinner layers of paint. So at most, I may have to do two coats of this kind of orangish brown hue. And I'm trying to put it on kind of thin so it dries a little bit faster. So again, the colors I'm using here, mostly orange with just a little bit of blue mixed in to neutralize the orange, to dull it down so it's not as super bright and almost neon-like. And if you cover up some of your fruit, not a big deal. Once we paint the fruit, that'll cover up some of those errors and slips. So I'm starting to see parts of this table where it's starting to dry. We have some like lighter areas now, like what we see here. So I'm just going over those just a little bit. Now, even in the photo, you can kind of see this. It's just not a straight color between all of those like dark wood grain textures. There are some variations. So once I kind of go through all of this, I can start to kind of blend in maybe just regular orange. So that'll help break up this kind of plain brownish color that we're looking at. So I can get a little bit of orange here, and then where it's wet, it should blend in pretty easily. And kind of like the top of the wooden box, we're not going to worry about the shadows right now. We'll do all those shadows once we start working with the fruit themselves. Now, as you add more and more paint to your paper, there's a likelihood that your paper is going to curl just a little bit, and that can make it difficult to paint. So if you're in the classroom, we do have the heat press. We did use that, or you most likely used it while we were working with the two-point perspective paintings with watercolor. Those papers, curl just a little bit. So you have that option if you're working from home. Um, After your painting's dry, you can put a bunch of books on it overnight. That'll help flatten it a little bit. Or if you use an iron, like you would iron your clothes. If your painting is really curling a lot, you can always use that. Just put maybe another piece of paper on top of it, or something to protect it, and iron the backside. Don't iron the side with the paint. Okay, so even though this is still drawing, I can start sketching in some of these wood grain lines. So I'm gonna get one of my brushes, has a little bit more detail to it. It's kind of a sharper point. And I'm just gonna get a little bit of violet. And I'm not gonna press down very hard. So I'm just gonna very lightly go over these. Just gonna slightly drag, create some hatch lines. And then while this is starting to dry, I'm going to take my brush that I was just painting my background with, and I'm going to go over these areas just a little bit, kind of blend in some of these darker colors. So again, this is those wood grain lines. And there's no real pattern to these. They're pretty sporadic. Some of them really close together, others not so much. They're a little bit further apart. And remember, if you hold your brush like straight up and down, you can get pretty sharp lines out of it. So this will be part one of the painting video. We'll have probably a couple videos. So this is just really everything aside from the fruit. As long as you're working with these long lines, that's really kind of the important thing to get some of this wood grain texture. You can see a few areas like here. As I was painting this area, the paint was trying to dry. It was kind of in this like middle-ish stage of drying where it wasn't quite wet, but wasn't quite completely dry, and my paintbrush like kind of pulled the paint up a little bit. So it's doing this again, which for this area it's not a big deal just because there's a lot of different values here. Um, but once we start working on the fruit, you'll want to kind of wait. So you got to kind of work with the temper paint whenever it's either wet or completely dry, because otherwise you can easily erase stuff that you've already done, and you don't want to run into that. I'm going to touch this spot up just a little. I accidentally erased stuff I didn't mean to. So again, I'm just taking my brush, has violet on it. I'm just kind of lightly skimming the top of the surface. So sometimes it's best to let everything dry to kind of see how everything looks, and then you can decide if you need to touch up some areas. All right, so I think we'll wrap it up there for today. So I'm gonna let this dry, and then the next video we'll look at the fruits. And so unlike when we started drawing the fruit, we're actually going to look at the things that are covered up the most and paint those first, kind of like what we did background, box, and then the table surface. So it's kind of opposite of how we drew it. So when we drew everything in that very first video, we were drawing the whole objects first. All right, so we'll stop there for today. Next video, like I said, we'll start working on the fruit. We'll see how all this table surface looks.